Okay. All right, so it's 1:55, so we can go ahead and get going. So today we have Gretchen Stokes here to give a presentation, and we have Dr. Sam Smith from Soil and Water Sciences to give her introduction. So Sam, I will just turn it right over to you.
Excellent, thank you, Allison. I'm happy to introduce my PhD student, Gretchen Stokes. She is in her 4th year at University of Florida. She's an SNRE IE student, IE PhD. Also picked up the ICGIS, interdisciplinary concentration in GIS, as part of her program. To do the full introduction to Gretchen would take probably 5 to 10 minutes. So I will give you the very brief introduction here, which is that Gretchen has been totally dominating her PhD. She has about every accolade you can ask for as a PhD student, including NSF, GRFP. She's even selected as Presidential Medal Fellowship. I think it's that's Presidential Medal Fellowship. Is that right, Gretchen?
Presidential Management.
Say it again.
Yeah. The Presidential Management Fellowship. Yeah.
There it is. Perfect. Yep. Which is a really high accolade. Her program has been split between University of Florida requirements and working with the United States Geological Survey. And as part of her project with the USGS, she's also been working with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So Gretchen has been tasked with, you can't understate the level of responsibility that has been tasked with Gretchen by the UN and USGS. And so she has been leading a global assessment of inland fisheries over the past basically 4 years. To put it very plainly, Gretchen's first publication ever as a student or as a professional was a lead author manuscript in PNAS, which is one of the top journals. And so I can't imagine there's too many students who could have that feather in their cap. But anyways, there's more to come from Gretchen as she finishes up her PhD and the work to come from it. But anyways, I'll stop talking. I could speak all day on the good things that Gretchen is doing. So other than that, I'll just let you take it over from here, Gretchen.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Thanks for the kind introduction and highlighting some of what we've been up to. So, and thank you all for joining today. It's great to be with you and to share some of the work from the last 3 to 4 years. And so my goal really today is to weave together the storyline of the different parts and pieces of my dissertation and into kind of the broader story of what Sam mentioned, which is working on this global assessment of inland fisheries. So my work has been very stakeholder driven in that the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or FAO, they really put out a call saying that this was a need and something that's been attempted for really multiple decades and years, and just has gotten to a point where the need is great enough that they reached out. And we kind of formed these different partnerships, and then that's where I stepped in. And the timing was quite interesting. I started working with them about 6 months before they were hoping that I could have a final global assessment of inland fisheries, which seemed absolutely impossible from my perspective, but was a very cool thing to get to work on, and a real privilege to have so many incredible collaborators and really working on kind of this high impact work that is already being implemented in several kind of international outlets, and then will continue to be featured hopefully next year as we're able to release the rest of the publications and get things out then. So with that, I will go ahead and jump in. I think the work that I'll share today, you'll see is very it kind of has this element of integrating the social and the ecological components. And that's been one of my major lessons learned and also one of the major draws for me to fisheries, is that you can't have people without fish and fish without people, and they are very interconnected. And that's been an exciting interface to work at for me. So I will share some of those things with you today. So to start off, just a bit of background for those of you who maybe don't know quite as much about inland fisheries. They are often overlooked because the marine world can often be kind of dominating, but just to highlight a few reasons that they are important. But first, actually, what do we mean when we say inland? So inland is nearly synonymous with freshwater, not completely, but generally inland waters are what you would think of. So lakes, rivers, streams, canals, reservoirs, and other landlocked waters. So when we're talking about inland fisheries, we're really talking about what you would probably think of with freshwater fish. And so they are really important both in terms of food security and biodiversity. So they, as you see here, comprise 40% of all fish species and 20% of all vertebrate species, which is pretty impressive because they come from less than 1% of the total volume of water on Earth. And yet they contribute both that biodiversity piece, but also over 40% of finfish production in the world. They do occupy all major habitats. So almost any crack and corner of the world that you could go to, there would be some variety of inland fish, and most of the inland fish that are caught are for human consumption. And so they're important sources of micronutrients and protein and also livelihoods. So the numbers that we know are in the billions for food production and food supply for folks, and in the millions for livelihoods. So they are extremely important, but they are also highly threatened, and the threats are diverse and they're increasing. And so I just wanted to highlight a few of these for you today. And most importantly, to note that the greatest threats to inland fisheries come from outside of the fishing sector. So in the marine world, it's often common that overfishing is the greatest problem. But in freshwater fisheries, as you can see here, there's a huge diversity of different threats, and often we find 5, 6, 10, 50 different pressures happening in one system. And often the drivers in the system are not necessarily overfishing, but rather all of these different land interface types of issues. So these include things like riparian habitat degradation, competing water demands for industry or agriculture, invasive species, runoff, pollution, flow modification from dams, and overharvest of species. So with all of this in mind, we know that that assessment is critical for conservation, that it's really a need, but as Sam kind of alluded to, thus far there is no standardized assessment for global inland fisheries. So we have a pretty good sense at a high level for marine fisheries, but inland freshwater fisheries, we don't have a way to assess all fish at a global level. And there's several reasons why this is really challenging. And these are things that I've kind of had to work through over the last few years as we've been trying to come up with an assessment. So the first is that freshwater systems are highly complex and heterogeneous, like this one. So this is in the Amazon, a river floodplain system. And when you have this type of complexity, it means that we can't delineate boundaries by country or administrative boundaries. We can't look only at single habitats or individual pressures. And instead, we need integrative approaches that can look at multiple threats, like we just talked about, and across land-water interfaces. So again, if you were trying to draw lines through a habitat like this, it would be nearly impossible to try to put those into units. And so we've had to think long and hard about how we could try to capture the complexities of ecosystems like this as we're looking at assessments globally. And a second reason that assessments for freshwater fish are challenging is because current monitoring methods are often time-consuming, expensive, and not very efficient. So some of you may have been involved in field sampling for water quality or vegetation surveys. And so you know the long days and hours and weeks that it can take to collect different parameters like flow or dissolved oxygen. And so sampling often requires a lot of people, it's often expensive, and it can even be difficult or dangerous to access different parts of the world. So as we're thinking about trying to assess and evaluate threats and the state of inland waters and inland fish, we simply can't get to every part of the world where they're found, and we can't have data from field collected data everywhere that we ideally would want. And so this is a challenge to come up with proxy measurements and to use other tools to be able to look towards a global assessment. And then the third thing that's been a challenge, and not only for fish, but just in broader terms is this idea of relativity in terms of threat. So when we think about threat, we ask the question, well, what is a threat? And so, we talked about all these different pressures on a fishery system. We have dams, we have climate change, we have overfishing. And so these all could be threats, but who is it to say what is a threat and how threatened is something? And I just wanted to give this as an example here, where we might have a fishery manager from the fishery on the left who says that their fishery is highly threatened and they're really concerned about the effect of pollution on sport fishing, for example. And then we might have a manager in this fishery on the right that says their fishery is also highly threatened because their lake is drying out from climate change and there simply are no fish left. So how do we determine how threatened these individual fisheries are? And then how do we weigh that when we put them side by side? And so this is the idea that relative importance can be variable and biased. And so how do we reduce that bias and try to come up with an objective look of comparing threats across different threat types and an overall kind of calibration of threat as we look at it in the world. And this is something that I'll talk quite a bit about today, because this is where there's really a need in the literature and kind of a gap in assessments that have been done thus far. So the purpose of my work and my dissertation specifically was to evaluate global assessment methods and then understand threats to fisheries and then apply both towards understanding an improved approach for assessment of inland fisheries. So why does this matter and what does this contribute to? There's kind of two pieces that can contribute to the broader kind of ecological area. And so first, it contributes an ensemble approach using a suite of methods to derive relative importance, which can be used to improve objectivity, like I just mentioned. And so this is not only useful in the world of fisheries, but really useful in trying to assess any kind of ecological pressures. And so we're trying to push towards a more objective approach in our work, but we see a lot of potential applications in other realms. And then second, the work provides a framework for assessing inland fisheries. And we've been able to iterate through several times now to understand the effectiveness of it and to work towards improvements and ultimately creating threat maps that can be useful to local fishery managers all the way up to FAO, kind of global policymakers. And so the idea of this is to have a scalable framework that's not only useful with a big global map, but that you can zoom into an individual fishery and understand what's going on and have an assessment of each of these types of threats across the board. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework itself, and then I'll talk about kind of the pieces of the puzzle that I wove into my dissertation as they relate to the assessment itself. So as far as how we kind of put this assessment together and thinking about, all right, how do we actually try to assess kind of numerically, quantitatively the state of inland fisheries or the threats that exist, we pulled three different pieces together in the puzzle. So the first is a hydrological framework. And the reason this matters is because of what I talked about before, where we can't use country boundaries, we can't use administrative boundaries. And so we have to rely on something that's meaningful in the world of fisheries. And so this would be hydrological basins. So this allows us to scale up and down. In this little image here, you can see we could look only at a part of the greater piece, or we could look at a larger basin itself. So that's the advantage of trying to summarize all of the information that we have at different hydrological scales. And then the second piece is a geospatial framework. So taking lots of different spatial layers and putting them together in meaningful ways. And then the third piece is this idea of relative importance, of saying, okay, we have lots of data, but what does this actually mean when we start to compare across different locations? And so this sort of trifold piece using threat weighting was our third component to the overall assessment. And so I'll briefly step through each of these three. First, I mentioned this idea of scaling. So needing to be able to scale up and down to different hydrological units. So here is the initial assessment that we did using Australia as an example, so we can see at the continental level, and you can see the Murray-Darling Basin overall outlined in white. And then if we zoom into that, then we can see along a river tributary that we could look more individually at certain areas and potentially assist with kind of a local management level application. And so this allows us, like I said, to look at these issues at multiple scales. The second piece, using spatial data, allows us to combine all of the different proxy measurements or actual measurements that we have that are affiliated with inland fish. And what I really want to emphasize here is we wish we had, but we don't have a global layer that perfectly can summarize all of inland fish catch. We don't really know that at a global level in greater detail than at a basin. So we know for different basins, and sometimes we have a little better resolution, but across the world, we don't have great fish catch data. And so then we have to bring in all of these other proxy measures to try to estimate peripheral measurements that can inform some of these categories that we don't have as good of information for. So this just kind of shows visually how we sort of stacked up these different layers. We've used, at one point we had pulled about 400 different spatial layers. And ultimately we've ended up with closer to about 150 that we feel like are really representative. So this is a pretty a large culmination of pulling together any possible data that could inform the state of inland waters and the fish that they live in. And this could be anything from pollution to climate change variables, things like temperature, wind patterns, and then things like water extraction or water use. All of these different parameters are things that we have spatial data for. And then finally is this idea of how do we assign meaning? So we could have all these different layers that say we have this much nitrogen entering into the systems, we have this many dams, and at these different scales, but those numbers on their own are only as useful as a summary metric. And so how do we then assign meaning to say this many dams equals this amount of threat, or this amount of nitrogen input is actually a problematic level versus maybe it's not so problematic. And so how do we assign weights to those things? And this is where we'll spend some of the upcoming time. So this is a little figure here to show the 3 different methods that we use to try to get relative influence or threat weights. And I'll just mention briefly that one of the best existing assessments of freshwater biodiversity and threats to freshwater biodiversity, which has been cited thousands of times and is a really leading study and an incredible resource. But when you look under the hood, the way that they have assigned weights and meaning to the different spatial information is based on only about 6 individuals that are all from Europe. And obviously when you have kind of that type of influence, then there's likely to be bias. And so our idea here is to take 3 different types of information and hope that we can capture enough objectivity and reduce the subjectivity or bias in each of them by combining them together. So some advantages here and disadvantages. So we're looking at quantitative modeling. The great thing there is that it's an automated process using boosted regression trees, and but it lacks a reality check. So we can run numbers, we can run models all day long, but they don't necessarily have that reality check. So that's where the expert opinion comes in, where we can talk to folks on the ground, where we can do a survey like I'll talk about in a moment, and we can gather information of what's actually happening on the ground and what are the real opinions of fishery managers. And then the literature review is an obvious starting point, but it is lacking for certain reasons, and mainly because not everything has been published. There's publishing barriers in different parts of the world. There's language barriers. So as much as we might have good data in that's been collected, we don't necessarily have it all in the literature. So you can see each of these has some bias, but again, we hope that by combining all 3 that we can reduce that. So this is just kind of a fun graphic that I made for science communication piece, but this sort of shares the process, the parts of the puzzle that we used. So again, first identifying the threats, taking spatial information, and then calibrating them by using these 3 different methods, and then ultimately producing a threat map of the world that can be used to inform different types of decision making and things along those lines. So just to briefly mention this, this figure here, which highlights the major basins important to global inland fisheries. This was showcased at the FAO roundtable and in the State of Fisheries report that they put out. And this is our first go around using the best information that we had. So like I mentioned in the beginning, I was given about 6 months to figure out what is the state of global fisheries. This was the result of it, but that relied only on the metrics that were available at that point. And so this is where I want to talk about my dissertation work and how it came into play. So these initial methods that we presented as kind of a first cut to say, hey, it is possible. We know it is possible to do an assessment, use these types of things. So we had to take synthesis reports, we had to use proxy layers, and we had to use a small subset of experts. And we realized some major gaps in those things, and that we really didn't have reliable enough data that we felt comfortable with. And so I've spent the last few years trying to work on the different pieces of the puzzle. And this is kind of a summary of what those look like. So doing a pretty extensive literature review with over 9,000 papers reviewed and data extracted from those. And then taking a huge deep dive into spatial data, like I mentioned, starting with over 400, and then doing lots of quality control checks on those to come down with the ones that actually are usable and relevant. And then finally, conducting a survey where we got over 500 fishery experts' opinions and perspectives, and captured those in one of the parts of this. So what I wanted to do is just walk through 2 of these pieces. The first starting with the literature review, and then talking about the expert opinion and that survey that we did and some of the things that we've learned along the way. So we'll start with looking at the literature. So when we're trying to derive weights from the literature, one of the things we quickly realized is the literature has exploded. And this is no surprise to any of you in academia. The rate of publishing has gone up pretty much exponentially over time, and there were simply too many papers to read. So we realized that even with the best of undergrad interns, trying to read 10,000 papers was just not possible. So instead, we turned to machine learning. And this is actually a really cool thing that we didn't really have a ton of experience with. And we brought in some collaborators who are able to help us kind of walk us through this process. And I'm not going to go into any of the details of the process today, but really just wanted to highlight that we used manual review for half of the articles, and then we used machine learning for the other half. And we got pretty good results. Overall, we learned that there are some limitations to machine learning, but for something of this size, it really was necessary. And so some key takeaways from that. As I mentioned before, literature can be biased. So here we can see some bias in things like pollution. Those are the green bars here. Across continents, we're seeing there's large amounts of abstracts and relevant papers about pollution. Now, this is probably in part because some companies require reporting. They have reporting requirements for dams in purple here, and for pollution outputs in green. Whereas some of the other things on here are much more challenging to measure. So things like aquaculture or climate change or erosion runoff, there just were not as many papers that showed documented direct impacts to fish from these different threats. And I should mention too that we really were focusing on the direct relationship. So not just that there was a dam that was causing problems, but the papers that we really wanted to record had to show a direct cause and effect. And so then the second thing that we learned from this was that it's incomplete as a standalone method. Well, why is this? And you can see here, these are some of the major basins to inland fisheries, and many of them have fewer than 20 papers that had direct documented impacts. And of course, you know, there's always caveats with this, but at the broadest scale, we see some basins have a lot of literature, other basins not so much. So we either know that the threat impact relationships are not well studied, or my kind of leaning is that they're not well published. So I've talked to lots of fishery managers, folks in Malawi or in Thailand or Vietnam, and they have a lot of information, but again, there's publishing barriers and reasons that they don't have these available kind of more broadly. And so, so this kind of speaks to how we can use the good from this, but also understanding the limitations. And then the third piece, which I just think is kind of an interesting one, not particularly relevant to the assessment overall, but I just think is something cool that we found, is that machine learning did a great job. And these numbers here, I'm not going to go into detail since we don't have time, but the performance of machine learning was best for classifying irrelevant papers, for saying these have nothing to do with a direct threat to fish. But it was less good at being able to get the sort of the detailed information about what kind of threat and the spatial impact of threat and kind of the finer scale detail. And we think this is a lot, or that this is related to the literature language in ecology being a bit messier than some. So medical papers, or using this in a medical context, is often really effective for extracting information because there is standardized language. But in ecology and in fisheries, there's not great standardization. And so we get a lot of noise in the way that people talk about threats and their relationship to fish. So again, this is just kind of a cool lesson learned as we went through this process. And then one piece that I just wanted to mention as kind of a future application is that there are these interesting links between drivers, impacts, and responses. And for where we're at with this global assessment now, we really are only able to look at drivers. We're not able to look directly at all of the impacts, or in particular, the responses in fish. And this is a goal. We'd love to get to this point of being able to not only evaluate what are the threats, but to evaluate what is this actually doing to the fish on the ground. And again, you can see here by the large thick bars for some papers indicating that there's a lot more evidence out there for some of these responses, some of these impacts than others. And so again, this is kind of a piece of the puzzle that would be really cool to explore, but that we weren't able to incorporate in this go around. So that brings us back to here. And the second piece that I want to highlight is some of the work that we've done on expert opinion and trying to understand localized threats as seen and as observed by fishery managers around the world. So to jump into that, with the help of FAO and the American Fisheries Society, we distributed a survey in June of 2020. And in total, there were 536 responses, and these orange dots indicate where the responses came from. So we did have really good global distribution. You can see the kind of mean summary at the bottom of who responded, and we were targeting fishery professionals. So it's not surprising that we have over half of the respondents with doctoral level degrees, kind of middle-aged with a good amount of experience. And so this captures kind of what we would expect for professionals within inland fisheries. And unsurprisingly, there were more male respondents than females, although that is a slowly growing ratio that's changing. And then we had 2/3 coming from government and academia, again, not surprising. So let's see. So a couple takeaways here that I wanted to highlight. The first is that across the board, respondents ranked habitat-related threats as the most common and the most severe threat. And so here on the left, where threat categories are plotted from lowest threats on the left to highest threats on the right, as far as overall threat of their fishery and how they perceived it. Habitat degradation was most frequently associated with all types of, or all levels of threats. So you can see this cream colored predominance across whether you had a low overall threat, habitat degradation was still the driving factor, or a high overall threat, habitat degradation again was sort of the driver. And then interestingly enough, when we look at the figure on the right, this shows the relative importance of each of the individual threat variables that we surveyed. And so the top 7 threats are all habitat related. So dams, riparian degradation, things like that. And when we look back at what we just talked about with the literature was heavily skewed towards pollution and then somewhat to dams, versus here we're seeing all very habitat driven threats being ranked highly. So again, this kind of speaks to the different puzzle pieces and how each is important and can offer different perspectives. So here we're adding diversity and using weights from a localized context. And then a second key takeaway is this idea of multiple threats. So this is no surprise to us, but it reiterates the need for us to consider how we incorporate multiple different threats into the global assessment, to not look at any one threat individually, but to look at the interactive effects between threats. So the figure on the left shows the distribution of the number of threats that participants indicated in their fisheries. And most respondents indicated 7 to 12 threats being present. And then you can see all the way up to 26, 27 different threats that they all marked that were significant threats. And then the figure on the right shows the relationship using a parallelogram across threat categories. And this reiterates the point that threats are all related in some way, shape, or form. And so again, taking multiple threats into consideration is really important moving forward, and something that we are continuing to think more about. And then again, just as kind of an interesting finding from this that I thought was worth highlighting, we found very little variability in the overall perceived threat score across demographic characteristics. So to me, this might mean that the sample was big enough to reduce the variability of perceptions, or it could mean that the perception of fishery threats might be shaped more by geographic fishery characteristics than demographic characteristics. So basically what we're seeing here in the red line that I added is to show these different demographic categories and how they responded to threat, and that there really is not a lot of variability. So it's not to say, those folks that work for government versus those in academia are perceiving threats radically different. We're not seeing folks with little experience and 50 years of experience perceiving threats radically different. And so this is good. This means that at some sample size, and we don't know exactly what that is, but that we can kind of make some assumptions about that the threats are really driven by the fisheries themselves and not by kind of the demographic characteristics of the respondents. And then finally, I just, again, similar to the literature, wanted to mention an interesting potential future application of what we found, which is this pretty strong negative correlation between increasing threat and decreasing adaptive capacity. So we included this on the survey because we hope that this can be something that we incorporate down the road into a global assessment, where we're not only looking at threats independently, but we're also looking at an area's ability to adapt to change over time. What resources do they have? Are they able to have assets or cooperation, flexibility, agency, adaptability, any of these metrics of adaptive capacity, and how those can help to mitigate threat. So we really can't just look at threat alone without saying, oh, well, some of these countries, some of these areas actually do have a lot of resources and may not suffer the consequences of these different threats in the same way. But here we're seeing that areas that have higher threats have lower ability to adapt. And so again, just something that we're really interested in considering down the road. And so this brings us back to the overall approach and thinking about the contributions of looking at literature more in depth using the expert survey and kind of where that brings us. it holistically. I'm not going to talk about the quantitative modeling piece, but this is a really useful tool that we have found using boosted regression trees. And I'm happy to talk about that later, but I'm not going to cover that today just for the sake of time. I did want to mention just one other kind of opportunistic piece of my dissertation that doesn't relate directly to the assessment itself, but kind of relates more to looking at acute onset threats and what we can learn about that given the recent global events. So looking at the past few years, my work on the assessment began in mid-2018 and then evolved quickly in 2019 when I presented it to the FAO Roundtable. Then I developed the survey in January of 2020. And then shortly thereafter, you can all, guess what is next to pop up on here. We all are very aware of the changes in 2020. And so the survey actually provided, it was ready to be distributed in early June, and we were able to actually add a question to the survey asking about how fisheries in real time were responding to COVID-19 and how something like the coronavirus might be impacting fisheries in real time. And this is really unique because often in science, we're looking back or we're looking forward and projecting things, but it's really pretty unique to look at something as it's evolving in real time and to capture that as it's happening. So it was pretty cool that the way that the survey worked out was that we sent it out in the midst of kind of the worst of the shutdown. And then we're able to capture some of these things between June and September of last year. So I wanted to just share, oh yeah, there we go. Wanted to just share a couple of things that came from this. Again, you'll see similar survey responses. Most folks did answer this question about COVID. And this figure shows their responses, which we asked them, what do you predict the pandemic may have on your fishery? What's the expected impact? And interestingly, responses were highly kind of scattered across the world, and roughly a third, and a third, as far as there'll be no change. There might be increasing pressure from the pandemic and might be lessened pressure from the pandemic. So we found this like just really intriguing and a cool thing to take a deeper dive in. So again, I'll just share a few quick things here. One of the main conclusions that we had is that the pandemic adds gradation to the otherwise relatively positive narrative that was the positive environmental narrative that was coming out. So we were hearing a lot about the world shutting down and things being on kind of on pause, this anthropause, and then that leading to positive effects, lower air pollution, things like that. And when we look at fisheries, we actually see it's not quite that way at all. We don't see this overwhelmingly positive response of all these fisheries that are getting better. And so, or that, stocks that are being replenished because there's less fishing. What we saw here is this interesting added narrative that really highlights the gradation that's happening. And so what I wanted to highlight here is the relationship with provisioning services. So we realized that inland fish served an important provisioning service during the pandemic, meaning that those returning from work in the cities or who lost jobs and needed subsistence or food were able to enter into fishing with a relatively low barrier. So a lot of the comments that we got in the responses talked about how fish were providing for people in a time of real need, and that they could enter into the fisheries without needing a lot of gear, without needing a lot of extra resources. And so these fisheries that had the highest provisioning value, that were contributing the most to livelihoods and for food, were also perceived to be those that were under the greatest pressure during the pandemic. And so the question I really have now, over a year later, is how this time frame is changing and how kind of these provisioning services are are sticking around or not, and what the overall long-term impacts will be. So yeah, we saw a lot of, or we read a lot of really interesting anecdotal pieces about in some areas fish were being depleted more rapidly because of illegal fishing, for example. There was no more monitoring, and so people were entering into the fisheries illegally and harvesting quite a bit. In other areas, there were lockdowns, and they did just stop fishing altogether. A lot of interesting nuances with commercial fishing versus subsistence fishing. Again, I don't have a ton of time to talk about all of that today, but if anyone is interested, this is the publication that Sam mentioned in PNAS, and it's fully fleshed out there if you're interested in reading more. So to conclude, I just wanted to highlight a few of these broader takeaways from this whole process of kind of start to nearly finish in creating an assessment. And all of the data that we collected from each of these individual processes highlighted the need in this whole assessment framework approach of needing a systems approach. So needing to look at the interdependencies of and the interactions between people and their natural systems, needing an ensemble approach that can consider all of these different threats and their interactions, an interdisciplinary approach, and using collaborative science and not seeing any one of these pieces as an individual piece, but rather kind of a piece of the greater whole. I'm going to skip over this for the sake of time, but we did write a little piece, just kind of what we've learned about collaboration. And more interestingly, this is just kind of a summary figure of what the assessment process has looked like. And these are the main players in the game and kind of those who I ended up working with and leading a team of. So this is what our team looked like. I kind of represented myself with a little blue circle above FAO, sort of being in the middle of all of these different organizations and individuals. And here you can see the colors of circles representing an individual, and it represents them by their discipline. And so just the need for bringing in individuals from all across the board. So we've worked with engineers, with communicators, with social scientists, with data scientists, and then even economists in this process. And so for me, it's just a huge lesson learned in what can be done if we sort of take a step back and look outside the box. So as I mentioned before, this work has been attempted for the last 20 or 30 years. And this is the first time that we've really been able to make some big steps forward. And I really believe that it is the power of collaborative science. So pulling in folks that know far more than me and trying to be open to looking beyond kind of our siloed versions of knowledge. So I definitely learned a lot in that process. And I guess just a couple of concluding thoughts. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but where are we going from here? So we are integrating and doing case studies. At the moment, this is a case study of Malawi that we're working on, and this will be out in the FAO State of Fisheries this coming summer, where we show an example of creating sort of a report card for individual basins. And then we're also doing testing. So I've been to several places and worked with folks on the ground, talked to them about, hey, does this work? Is this useful? How can we make it better? We're also wrestling through things like how do we look at threat in large water bodies and do modeling hydrologically into water versus just kind of looking at the basin and the land side of things, but recognizing just the enormity of these water bodies and the dynamics within them. And then, yeah, ultimately, as I mentioned, there's a lot of ways that we can expand this moving forward, but more immediately working towards implementing this kind of assessment framework in a variety of ways. So we've had a lot of interest from different global organizations, Conservation International and WWF are among those who are really excited about what's coming. And then, as I mentioned, this will be featured again in the State of Fisheries next year, and that should say 2022. And then the Convention on Biological Diversity is also looking at updating their targets and finding a way to incorporate inland fisheries. And so there's some cool applications that might be able to be derived from this work. So on that note, and I know that was a lot, but just wanting to highlight the many folks who have been a part of this. And I love this quote. I think it captures a lot from my dissertation: to go fast, go alone, and to go far, go together. It's been a great team effort and a privilege to share some of the things we've learned with you all today. And with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gretchen. That was fascinating. Just really, really interesting and just wide reaching, really cool. So yeah, so everybody, we have about 5 minutes for questions for Gretchen.
And I see a comment in the chat from Orlando. It is the first time I see some the different presence of abstracts. Yes, and that's a great, thanks for highlighting that. It was interesting to see just the diversity that does exist, and then also recognizing published in different places. One note on that is that we didn't look outside of English publications, but that would be a great continuation to be able to capture more from different parts of the world. So any other questions? Thank you all for those thoughts. All right. No questions.
I think you answered all the questions. Preempted everybody. Okay, well, we can break. Oh, let's see. Yeah, Megan had a comment there.
Oh, cool. Limitations. Yeah, awesome. And Megan, I'd be happy to chat if this is something that you're using or interested working on. It's been a fascinating realm to work in. And I think, you know, as with any tool, there are always significant limitations, but really useful applications. And so just trying to parse those apart and figure out which tool is the right one for the types of questions that you're asking. So yeah, feel free to reach out if you do have questions about that.
Yeah, I just remind everybody that Gretchen's email is on the flyer. So if you do think of questions or want to reach out, that's where to find her info. So Gretchen, thank you again so much for such a fascinating talk. And it was great to see you again.
Great to see you as well.
Yeah, and to everybody else, thank you so much. This was our last seminar. Gretchen, you capped off our semester. So so if anybody has questions as we were wrapping up this semester, you know, anything at all that you'd like to touch base with me about, please feel free to do that anytime. And yes, thank you everybody for being here today and all through this semester. This is my first time, Gretchen, doing sort of leading this seminar. So it's been really, really fun. I got to see so much like interesting research that I never would have seen otherwise. So anyway, okay, well, thank you to all of you. Thanks, Gretchen, and I will see you all later. Have a wonderful break and end of your semester.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.